Another thing I was fascinated with this particular piece was the shadows.
First off, I just want to talk about your work as choreographer before we back up to artistic director. Aniel, the second piece on the program, it's a U.S. premiere for us this week. And one of the things I was struck by, especially where you've placed it in the program, is the sense of humor that you have found in working with the dancers and in this piece. And humor is hard. It's hard in dance. It's hard in lots of stuff. Could you talk about your sort of discovery of that in the process of making the work?
Yes, humor, I think, is one of the hardest things to achieve on stage. It was certainly something that did not come to me naturally first as a choreographer. It's something that I think I visit in my life, but I was very, very tentative to try to do in my work, primarily because I think it's so difficult. A lot of my work in the past has been more about philosophical states, a little bit more, I don't want to say darker, but a little bit moodier. So I had an agenda with this piece, and that was, I wanted to do something whimsical. I wanted something to be a bit more absurd, playful, but still crafted and still a form of intelligence. Because often when we see something lighter, we think, oh, that's not as serious, that's not saying something. And I think it takes a lot to get in there and create joy. And also be saying something as a choreographer.
So you had your agenda before or after you turned to John Zorn's music?
Before. And I also had this idea that I wanted to work with some form of jazz music. And of course I started to research that, just because a lot of the work we do and a lot of the work I've done as a dancer in my history has started through improvisation. Although I was classically trained, once I started to work with someone like William Forsythe, and even prior to that, we would do pieces that were completely improvisational based with very, very specific tasks. So that was something familiar. And I wanted to go into jazz music for that reason and to kind
because of that kind of exploration of structure.
Absolutely, of structure and just various timings and intricacy. I landed on John Zorn's music, delightfully so. And he, I'm sure most of you know, has a huge, he's very prolific. And there were these Book of Angels that were his basically he wanted to research his Jewish background. And he went into he was very inspired by the use of klezmer, or wanting to go into the use of klezmer, or researching klezmer. And this is what transpired. And they are a body of I believe about 29 CDs. I mean, it's an incredible collection. And these are various tracks from that. I immediately emailed John and said, you don't know who I am. You don't know the company, I don't think. And would you allow us to use this music? And he was so generous. And he's turning 60 this year. A
big celebration.
A big
in
celebration all over,
yeah.
And he was hoping to come to the show, but he wasn't able to make it. But it was once I heard the music, I went, oh my goodness, I can see this world where things can be kind of upside down, and that's the way it is. And I often said to the dancers, it's like if you shake a hand with someone. We always think shaking a hand has to be a certain way, but what if you shake a hand like that? It's still shaking a hand. It's in a different world, though.
One of the things I was thinking about is that maybe part of the reason you were able to sort of discover the characteristics of these dancers is because you're working with them. Yes. So very different from a freelance kind of operation where you'd maybe come in and have a couple of weeks. Could you talk about sort of knowing the dancers and how that lets you dig in a different way?
You're absolutely right, Maura. I have often, my work so far has been me going into actually ballet companies, contemporary companies, and having about 2 or 3 weeks to meet a dancer and right a conversation with a dancer, and then actually ask them to go into a world and build a work. I often spent a lot of time just getting to know a dancer and wanting to find out what was inside of them. And then the work started to transpire. Now that I have a company of dancers who I know, I can get right to the work and I can get right to the conversation of what the idea of the piece is. And the premise of the company is that we are creation-based. So we do primarily new work. Since 2009, we've added over 30 new works to our repertoire. My idea for the company is that I have a group of dancers who can not confront, but can meet someone, a choreographer, for the first time, and that choreographer can make a work that they want to make, that they would make if they had their own company.
And that the dancers are just open to whatever.
Absolutely, and versatile enough to be able to be an open slate, or a clean plate, and be able to start. I keep saying the art has to stay in the center of the room, and that is where we really try to work collectively. So the dancers produce a lot of, they work very, very closely with every choreographer that comes in. Most of the vocabulary is in conversation with the choreographers, but I think that's where dance is going, or has gone. There's a huge responsibility on the dancer today. It's no longer, here's the step, mimic what I'm doing, and put it on 5 and 6 and 7, 8. That is a craft, and the dancers have to do that. But they have to also be able to come to the table with their own understanding, their own questioning, and they have to be able to be versatile enough to explore a range of possibilities and to take leadership in how they build the work.
So when you'd been working as a freelancer when the opportunity came up for you to be artistic director, so you sort of had freedom and institution, and could you say a little bit about what you learned in your time away from Ballet BC where you had danced, and then the decision to come back to it?
Come back to an institution?
Yeah.
That started already from the National Ballet of Canada. I actually, it's a nice story for myself personally. Is I was 16, just about to turn 17, and I was coming out of the National Ballet School, and it's, as some of you may or may not know, it's one of our leading classical ballet schools in Canada. And it was actually through William Forsythe, who was coming to do his very first creation for the National Ballet of Canada. And I was in the back row of Don Quixote, doing a little bit of that. And I think he watched some of class, and the next thing I knew, I was being hired into the company to be in his work. So that started a very different curve for me. I knew already when I was studying to be a classical dancer that I wanted to work with choreographers. I worked with Rudy Van Danzik when I was 11. And just being able to research and explore my own independence and my own voice within someone's world was incredibly liberating. And then to have a craft, to have a technique to work with. And I do think ballet is one of the most articulated trainings right now, and I think more than becoming something that is a codified language that we're going to watch on stage, it's going to become an essential language that every dancer
just
uses.
as the place, the training itself that then allows people to do all kinds of things.
Because even a lot of our classical choreographers are not using ballet in such a codified way anymore. It doesn't, I don't think it exists. They want to create movement invention. So that was my exploration. Then I went through the National Ballet of Canada, and then I went to Frankfurt Ballet, where the world turned totally upside down on me. I went from doing more of Bill's, William Forsythe's neoclassical work. This man has an incredible trajectory. I mean, the first piece I was in was 45 minutes with 8 women, all improvisation. We had 60 modalities. We had an alphabet from A to Z, and we had clocks. And I was about 20, 21, and I had never been on stage having to govern myself like that. And the piece was actually called Self-Meant to Govern, which was the first part of Eidos Tellos. So I went through that experience for 5 years, where the world was being shifted on me. And then I went to Ballet BC, where I went back more into a more traditional institution, but was also very much about new work, and John Elaine was there. So then I decided I had to leave companies. I was growing out of being able to work in a collective, and I wanted to work. I had the pleasure of meeting Margie Gillis, who is one of our great solo performers in the world, and she started to mentor me, and I thought I was going to go into solo work as a solo performer. And then somewhere in myself, I always knew I wanted to direct, but as a woman, I wasn't sure in a situation where I really wanted a company that wasn't just about my work. I knew there would be steps that would happen, and I may or may not have the ability. Even though I knew I could do it, I didn't know if everything would line up. So I went away from the institution because I didn't think it resonated with what I needed as a performer, but I came back to it because I actually think it's a structure that can really, really give so much to our dance world. And I believe very strongly that I wanted to also try and create a different understanding of what artistic leadership is within our field.
And because you're getting to both make work with dancers but you're not solely responsible for the artistic output.
I do one piece a year, and then I have the pleasure of supporting every other choreographer that comes in and every dancer, and that really is my joy. I love creating, but I love also watching other people explore. When I was 25 and telling Bill Forsythe that I was leaving Frankfurt Ballet, he said, "What, are you crazy? Why aren't you staying? Why aren't you still dancing?" And I said, I don't have to be on stage every day, but I have to be in the studio. And that was very confusing for me, but also something that made me go, I know that I will always have to be in the studio. I still take class every day. But it's really important to me to help cultivate the conversation of where choreography is going, where the training is going in our dance world, and also what is artistic leadership? What is the purpose of our artists right now? Why are we here?
One of the things that is so striking about the 3 works that you've brought here is, I think, we're amidst a conversation about gender. The first piece is so androgynous, and then at the end, it's the content, not just the dancing, is really about the men and women. And could you talk a little bit about lucky commissions, that it just turned out that these are some things people were thinking about, or was it something that in conversation with the choreographers you were sort of eliciting from them?
Well, not in this case. There are commissions, like when we just had Jose Navas create Giselle. That was a very specific commission, and I asked him, what do you think about doing Giselle, and will you please do it in a very new and contemporary way? With the first piece, that existed already, and Jacopo is a former colleague of mine in the Frankfurt Ballet. His work is all over the world, but that work has had a couple of lives, and when he made it for our company, he remade it. When he mounted it for us, he kind of recreated it at the same time. Jacopo's world has that sense of androgyny, and I think it's like an organism going alive and coming to life and reshaping itself. And I find that so fascinating in our society today, because it's really talking about energy, but there's also a generational angst within the work, that you're almost fighting to find yourself within this collective, but you're having to work as a group. And for Jacopo, that's the power. He's always been fascinated with that independence within a collective and building that sense of androgyny. I think he just wants to neutralize that world, and I think that's where we're getting closer to in our world.
Well, it's interesting to compare it to the last piece, where although very clearly marked as men and women, and the text that we hear, they do the same movement vocabulary. I mean, not exactly in the duets, but in the big dance sections for the whole group, they're all dancing. So it's an interesting sort of...
Yes, and Medhi, I think he definitely wanted to have a conversation about men and women, and one could see it more traditionally, but in a way, I think what he was saying is that, these are, by accepting the fact that we are different, you actually allow people to be equal.
This is a question about the last piece that we saw this evening, and the use of the spoken word, and that we hear it in a very deliberate way, and then in some other ways as well.
I think Medhi Walerski is, if you have the chance to see Netherlands Dance Theatre today, Medhi is one of their star dancers. He's gorgeous. But the reason I bring that up is because the Netherlands Dance Theatre, I mean, there's a lot of their work that does bridge into dance theatre. And so I think a lot of our choreographers today are interested in using text to some degree, because it connects our audience into a world where they hear a word that they can recognize. And it's been around in dance theatre for many years. I think that Medhi brought it to life because it gave him the opportunity to make more concrete some of the conversations about the difference between men and women. And then just some of the sounds that you hear, I think it's just an extension of the well, I won't use again the word whimsy, but of his world that he was creating. I'm not sure I think he was going on instinct, and then afterwards I think it's a part of his language that he goes in and out of. Yeah.
And a great thing for people who are trained in ballet to sort of have this other kind of voice of expression after being sort of so silent in the studio for a while.
I mean, often the way we made Aniel actually is we created all of the vocabulary out of sounding. So we actually made very unusual words like chifferoo, and they had to actually create vocabulary based on these very unusual sounds that became words that became sentences.